that in 5 or 6 years' time, the John Dennis Memorial Lecture will be being given by Mr. Eric Owen Moss, and the room will be overflowing and people will be watching on video upstairs. And that's not such a throwaway line. I think it's very interesting, if I can just be tolerated for 2 minutes, to look at the exhibition that we have here, that is growing daily, I may add. Every day the customs officers let a little bit more of it out, and it's larger than it was this time last night, and I predict it will be larger tomorrow night, etc. If one looks at that exhibition, and if one looks at the catalogues of the 2 or 3 exhibitions that have been held in the United States in the last year on the work of the West Coast, and if one looks at the trajectory of this architect, one sees rather interesting things. First of all, buildings always of originality, but perhaps in the earlier work there's a sort of curious vulgarity happening as well. And then something quite unique happens, which is, as the buildings become more extraordinary, they become less vulgar. I think in most comparative work one gets almost the opposite thing happening, which is that as things get less vulgar, they become boring, or you know, one can make several other constructions of those characteristics. But this, I think, is a fascinating thing. Those of us who saw the Petal House, quite a large group of people from there saw the Petal House recently, and I think all agreed that it was much the nicest piece of his work. It is the latest building that we saw, and it is quite a preposterous notion that a house should rise up and open out like a petal and should have curious things dangling down from the sides and down into the garden and so on. But it works, and in many ways it is very scholarly, dare I say it. And I think that it takes, as I was suggesting last night, I think it takes a little bit of time for those of us who tend to think in straight lines and tend to think in seemly sequences of ideas. It takes a little bit of time for such work to be digested, because it just breaks all of those things that we're taught in architecture schools to recognize. Nonetheless, of course, it will be gradually realized, and that is why I confidently predict that Eric Owen Moss will give the famous lecture in 6 years' time. 5, says Alvin, so that's almost a deal.
He can redesign the hall for you.
Right. And he's got a lot of slides, and I've only seen 2 or 3 of his buildings, so I've got my tongue hanging out to wait to see the rest. Eric.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks for having me here. I'm happy to take advantage of the opportunity of demythologizing Los Angeles a bit. And let me begin to do that by starting straight away with the first slide.
Just turn off the projector. This is for
This is not an image of Los Angeles in a literal sense. The reason I have a few slides here by way of a kind of introduction, and I hope it doesn't sound pompous or pretentious or like an attempt to develop a kind of philosophy of history, but it is by way of trying to communicate things that I feel are pertinent to the process of processing the work that I do. One of the things that I feel, and I think a number of us feel in one way or another, has to do with issues that people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Oswald Spengler, a number of others, wrote about over the last 100 years, that have to do with the kind of decline of values and beliefs in the West. And I think the last vestige of that architecturally was what we call modernism, and modernism, as I understand it, in the sense of a kind of belief in the ultimate prowess of the rational, or the ability to understand things rationally, or the sense that finally everything is amenable to law and to order and all of that. And I think it's interesting. A sort of common feeling at currently is that things move very quickly. Inventions come and go and all of that. It's my feeling that actually the strongest point in time in that regard, in terms of speed and change, was really the 19th century, which gave us or suggested that we might have cars and automobiles and phones and houses heated and streets lighted. And all of that, and having gotten all of those things, that somehow everything would be sort of okay, and everything would work out all right. And those processes that gave us all of those inventions had to do with this kind of lionizing of science and reason, and all of that. But in fact, having gotten all of those things, we'll find that all of those things don't do what the hell they were supposed to do. And as a consequence of that, one starts to look around for other ways, other means of understanding, other kinds of order, but they oughtn't to be artificial. They can't be imposed or reimposed. And it's my feeling now that the process of uncovering those things starts first internally, probably at a level of a kind of self-indulgence, the sort of ultimate selfishness. I've heard Frank say that somewhat facetiously, but also somewhat honestly, I think, that his essential interest is himself. That he probably couldn't get away with saying that at other points in time. But I think now for me, I mean, it rings true and is valid in the sense that that's the point from which sort of new notions, new orders, new perceptions will emanate, which finally will be developed in a collective sense. This is a drawing that Isosaki did while he was still with Kenzo Tange in the early 60s. And I think it makes a similar point in slightly different ways. At that time, Tange's office, and I'm sure you all know, was spanning Tokyo Bay and the harbor in Boston and Bologna and Skopje and all of that, with these gargantuan masts and frames and all of that. And a peculiar sensitivity would have to arise, which is certainly the case in Isosaki's case, to see the kind of limits of all of that, the finiteness of those kinds of ideas. So that just as the kind of ideology that made the Parthenon came and was understood and felt and dissipated and disappeared, likewise, the ideology of a kind of architecture as architect as engineer, long spans, the ideology of the machine in a kind of literal sense, that too will come and go, and in fact is I think well on its way. And again, that has to do with, I think, the sense that ultimately there are limits to all of these things. I think if you feel that, you can't be didactic about this stuff. I mean, you can't say any longer, do it this way and no other way. And it strikes me, it's interesting, if you look at Hitchcock and Johnson's book, written, I guess, in the early 30s, and it's sort of fascinating to look at the pictures in the back of the book as if they were graded by an instructor who knew what was up and what was down and what was left and what was right and what was proper and what was improper. So flat roofs and ribbon windows and this white and that pilotis and that thin and all of that stuff at that point in time seemed to be a kind of digestible and manageable ideology. And I think it no longer is. There's another way at this kind of problem. This is Tatlin's glider. The reason that I show it is, I think, aside from its sort of political implications, that again it shows a sort of innocence and enthusiasm and joy in the process and prowess of the machine and what it can do, and looking forward to what it can do in terms of making a new world for a new man. All of that. That kind of convolution or evolution, and this is a bit of a caricature, obviously, but I think for us, or let me just say for me, at the self-indulgent level, that diagram is, the Tatlin diagram is no longer felt. And it seems that whatever way one sort of does it, one has to move on to the next thing, and it may be an awkward kind of moving, a sort of inordinate kind of moving, a clumsy kind of moving, which is sort of necessary in an attempt to go on to the next thing. And in that process, one is extremely self-conscious and uneasy, and those kinds of feelings may actually be virtues. Sort of looking over one's shoulder to see what's coming and not quite sure what one is capable of or likely to produce. And I think one has to sort of get comfortable with the feeling of this character at this point in time. Now let me switch gears and see if I can tie in the little preface into a few of the projects that we've managed to build over the last 7 or 8 years. This was a house, was and is a house near LA International Airport. A unit in the back and a unit on top. The area is called Playa del Rey. It's a sort of beachy community. I mean, if one wanted to cartoon the beach community of Los Angeles, one might pick an area like that. And in an attempt, and Peter referred to it as vulgar. I'm not. It may be that. Not only may it be that, but it may be that that's part of the quality of the architect and the feeling of the architect vis-a-vis the context in which the thing was done, which is not to say the intentions are crude. Some of them may be subtle, but the attempt is to intervene in almost a kind of samurai way. There is still, and I guess it has to do a bit with my own sort of background in education, which ultimately I think I'm closer and closer to dispensing with. But at this point in time, there still is the sort of vocabulary and language of the sort of hardware store, you know, and not a deification of it in the kind of Rogers or Foster sense at all. And I had, I think, a feeling even then that was a sort of adolescent thing to do, an undeveloped thing to do. So it has those qualities, but in a sort of exaggerated kind of way. Those round bulkheads in the front are covered with fiberglass, which is a sort of local surfboard material, that being a way of traversing the waves on the beaches of Los Angeles. And I guess it's been said, and I don't know that this was part of the intention, that it also has in it the kind of ship's language and all of that with the requisite cable, rails, stacks, and all of that. And then there's a kind of overt homage, if you missed it, up on top to the Oxford thing, which has always fascinated me. And I think of sort of current practitioners, Isosaki and Sterling are two that I've spent a lot of time looking at. there are actually 5 colors of yellow that go up the side there, which also has to do with the entrance. I mean, there's a whole kind of line of rhetoric that goes with the thing. I'm not so sure how, I mean, it's hard to get it out anymore, because I'm not sure that was really what the thing was about, although it may in a certain sense. I mean, issues of view and issues of access and the language that one uses to designate those components, I guess, is still in there. So it has a sort of quasi-functionalism in it, strange to say. Functionalism meaning kind of, at a certain level, attempt to designate certain parts with certain particular gestures. And this is the how it fits. This is the plains of Nazca in the Peruvian desert. I've sort of developed an interest in these attempts that go back hundreds or thousands of years on the part of particular cultures to synthesize things, to put things together in a way that I don't know how to do. One can't literally extrapolate one from the other. In this particular case, the pieces, this is actually the leg of a chicken, but they're colossal in size. They're big sculptures cut into the earth, miles in length in some cases. The meaning of them, I mean, somebody inevitably tries to stuff a computer program into it, in order to make it intelligible in our terms. The meaning of them isn't clear, except that again they were a part of an attempt to make the world intelligible to the people who were involved at that point in time. And this is the plains of Nazca in downtown Los Angeles, done roughly the same time as the first building and built slightly later. It's a small warehouse, frontage of about 120 feet, divided into 4 units. And the building actually is developed in a sort of literal, and I don't know whether at this point to be apologetic about that, but a sort of literal functionalist way, in the sense that programmatically we were asked to deliver to the owner sort of 4 components, each of which ran from front to back and access off the alley, loading and service, and from the public street, pedestrian and so on. Within that format, there are these, that's the plan, it's pretty straight stuff, and the section. The process of making the thing, I should say parenthetically, was also one that, and again, this may have something to do with my background, that I'm still interested in how objects are made at a very kind of tiny constructivist level. And we used actually, for the roof here, a prefabricated modular system, which is sort of throwaway, cheap system, made by a company called Duke Timber, interestingly enough. So that's the roof system, and the only sort of odd stuff was about the first 10 or 15 feet of the building, which had to do again with the intervention of this particular thing on a public street. The area is a sort of introverted, close it up, lock it down, nail it shut kind of area. And there was a sort of, and I think this has to do with a certain amount of innocence in that regard, but there is a kind of exuberance about this that wants to defy those qualities of the society that tend to lead to sort of lock it up and nail it down, to be the extrovert in a context which is essentially the introvert. So that sort of exuberance, I think, is there to be read. The cylinders are actually, when it was first drawn, they were supposed to be poured, and we couldn't pay for that. So we found some sewer pipes I think the connection at a verbal level sounds better than the connection at a literal level. But in any case, they're like barber poles, really, or signs. They don't do much of anything. There's a drain pipe that runs through them internally, and there's some closet space. But the signage or aspect of the cylinders is essentially what they're about. And then the elaboration on the sort of services, exaggerated in some cases and omitted in others. And it's, it has the right stuff in that sense, the exposed conduit and the industrial light and the glass block and all of that. There were some attempts at a subtle level, I think, to begin to question the meaning of the language. There's block with rake joints, block with flush joints, that's painted so the implication is that block is block and block isn't block. There may be sort of small issues in the face of things like the plains of Nazca, but taken in total, they have very much to do with issues of kind of personal development, and those concerns inevitably show up in different contexts at different magnitudes. This is actually a project that Frank got for me. It must have been about 1977. It's not so much an attempt to this particular sort of monkey business with a slide to make it look like a satellite as it is to communicate something which lacks a place, a home, or a place to land, or a place to be comfortable. It's a house for this. This is actually another form of the thing. To see it as a revolver, although I'm not sure that's communicated in this particular slide. Maybe we ought to just pass over that one. It wasn't meant as an advocacy of violence, but again had to do with sort of finding a meaning or a variety of meanings for the building at very different scales, and it happened to look like a pistol. This is the original house, which is reached by going up a drive and then across the front and into the garage. So it was an existing kind of L-shaped building with a pool in the back and a hill that sloped down to the pool. And what essentially was done was to demolish the building, but to leave as a kind of residue of the building its position on the site. So that was done. And I think it's interesting, in looking at Frank's, parenthetically looking at Frank's house last night, that one of the things that house has suggested, and I think it suggested it to nearly anybody who's cared to look, is the notion of relations between old stuff and new stuff. And I think in this and in the little place at Playa del Rey, my interests and intentions, and I think they're quite modern in this sense, was to turn the thing over completely, to make of it a kind of object in total, and by and large to ignore really the sort of language, the literal language, or the residue of the original building. That's not quite true in this context, but it comes fairly close. In any case, this is a site plan. And the first floor, which is the main floor, and the organization of the building was largely kept. The little alcoves that hang off the front house pinball machines, which were, I always sort of have to explain, this was a project. We did the construction documents. The guy was, I was about to say the guy was a serious guy. I don't know quite whether that's true, but his intentions, I think, up to the final moment were genuine. In any case, he was a collector of pinball machines, which is probably the subject for another discussion in terms of what art is and isn't. But in his sense was that clearly these were as legitimate as or illegitimate as any other thing, and that one ought to kind of provide an environment suitable for a particularly special kind of object of art. So he had 5 of these machines. In addition, he had this sort of funky old car, which you see there off to your right, which we sort of treated as the 6th pinball, and that piece of the garage was a kind of cascading hunk of wall going from solid to glass, so that you could see the automobile as you sat in the living room. Again, the language, there are little things that start to be suggestive of I think, other kinds of interests, but the language, I think, still has the kind of residue of the machine, the nomenclature, the numbers, which look like something sort of out of the Magna Carta. I think those kinds of things, although the small, start to suggest an evolution of interest and attitude. The skin was to be made out of a corrugated metal. And the order of the building essentially depended on 2 parallel channel girders that ran the length of both arms of the L, and to which everything was framed, above which the sort of air handling stuff went floating along and poked through at the sort of appropriate intervals in order to allow everybody to breathe. So it has a kind of structural, mechanical, industrial order that was essential to its kind of meaning. On this particular end, sort of around, excuse me, around the corner from the front door, there's the profile of the original building, that sort of shed roof stuff. So there was a kind of residual interest in exploring that. At this point, it's still residual. And this is a section which kind of evolves as one moves up and down the line. You can see the 2 channels parallel to each other. Those were to be steel, and the software stuff running above it and poking through. At some points, that wood framing was exposed. The profile of the ceiling over this kind of mini galleria changed as one went sort of from entrance to galleria to bedroom. And then you can see the pinball machine there with a sort of skylight and neon and all of that. And then a section through the entrance, you can see that, well, there's a clear story window over the entrance, and the profile of the curve has changed. So there isn't any particular inclination to correlate a kind of internal and external condition in terms of form. And the sort of deified automobile. The diagonal stuff, which was, I mean, the frame, the white frame, was stuck in there for reasons nominally structural, but it still was a reflection of a particular interest, which remains an interest in mine, which again has to do with sort of putting these things together. But I think it becomes more and more selective, and in the last thing I'll show you, almost obscure. This is actually a rough study of the final project that we did the construction documents on. The building wasn't built. This is a little house, a guest house for a friend, also wasn't constructed, who lived in Malibu, which is the strip of land that and ocean and highway that runs north of Santa Monica, where they perpetually have fires and landslides and have to be a sort of hardy character to make an attempt to live out there. And what happened was they had a guest house and it burnt, and he asked me to do another one. It's a tiny building. The stair, and I think in fairness and in honesty, the issue of movement as part of the process of organization obviously has a excuse me, a long modernist lineage, and I think that's still part of my interests. It may start to pervert some in projects as we move on from here, but the use of that as a part of the language of the building is still part of the process. And this is about 1978, 79. The start to be now other kinds of issues raised. This sort of exaggerated kind of buttress column. In a context where the piece could be cantilevered, and obviously it has to do with making, has to do with a number of things. It becomes sort of comment on my comments and sense of the meaning of structure. It has something to do with the making of the entrance and symmetry and all of that sort of stuff. And the image of the building in total makes something of a new form, which is essentially round, and the form of the original building, which had this very simple kind of hip roof. This is from the top, little deck from which one could go up and see the Pacific Ocean. The thing is sliced so that, as you can see, so that the two walls aren't parallel. One can sort of justify that in terms of views and all of that. I don't, and notwithstanding that, I think that's really not what it's about. I think it had to do with the process of kind of making the object both on the inside in terms of the space and in terms of what it was on the outside. Kind of simple seating, and then a cooking dining area, and a loft above. And then a series of chunks or partitions or walls that have a variety of obligations as one goes through the building. Small deck at the back. This is another. It's not really an effort to get a few giggles or to be cute. I guess it's somewhere between the prosaic and the hilarious, and it sort of depends where you land in between those two poles. Again, this interest in other cultures and their sort of means of synthesizing and explaining and understanding is one that seems to be a useful tool for me in kind of running what I think is the conventional kind of architectural formalism that abounds. And this actually isn't a particularly happy story or project, but there may be some lessons in it nonetheless for me, if not for you. The building was a 5-unit condominium in an area called Pasadena, which is slightly north of downtown Los Angeles, which is a mixture, the area of affluent stuff and kind of stuff in the middle, and then stuff on the sort of low end. And this particular building was to go in an area of 1- and 2-story bungalow buildings, which were all in the process of being knocked down and replaced by apartment units of one form or another. To sort of tie in this Easter Island business, this particular wall, and each wall had a kind of mission. The building is fairly straight and austere, allegedly because of what it was supposed to cost. And having arrived at a kind of preliminary diagram for glazing on that wall, by making some adjustments, it became clear that one could give a kind of lesson in how to draw an Easter Island face. And that lesson was to be rendered with sliding glass and double hung glass and joints and downspouts and all of that, excepting the piece on the end, which is a profile. It's absolutely a kind of non sequitur if one gets literal about the context, but I guess if one gets very abstract about it, one can, or I can, sort of feel comfortable with an intervention that comes from 8,000 miles away. I think it still has a meaning. Meaning may be better understood by people who aren't born yet at a certain point in time. Maybe that's presumptuous. Anyway, the attempt is to do that sort of thing. In any case, this is the roof and the 4 elevations. The one on your right is the street elevation. We had a bit of a problem getting the building approved at all because the site is very narrow. It's 50 feet in width, and one had to demonstrate that it was part of what was already in the neighborhood, however sort of outlandish that may sound. And the mechanism for that actually was to slice this window, which is an analog for the bungalow. It's made out of glass block. Was supposed to be mirror glass block, to slice this kind of analog of the other stuff on the street into the face of the building with sort of appropriate chimneys and gables and all of that. And given the right drawing, the building was actually approved, which means somebody actually believed all of that, and we went ahead. Just take you around the building. Pedestrian access, which is a half a level up. There's a parking floor a half a level below, which is accessed on the other side of the thing. There's again this sort of exaggerated kind of double cantilever corner support, and the window is simply a bubble skylight turned on its side. This is really the only slide I have of as close as we got to realizing what was intended, at which point I think the color certainly finished it off. We sort of agreed to go different, or disagreed to go different directions or something. And what finally happened was that and this is the dome, which is a particular internal and external event. If one reads a thing as a train, with this at the front for the master suite in the front unit. It shows you actually that when people advocate these prefabricated kind of off the shelf and all of that stuff, what you can do with this system of studs and plywood, and in fact you can do damn near anything. We had a bit of a problem with the shingles, which actually had to be, because they follow the curve, actually had to be nailed and glued on that sort of surface which slopes down. But this is what finally happened. I guess about 1979, when we're sitting in the office trying to entertain ourselves, a guy sort of wandered in, kind of strange and interesting guy, who was trying to sell airplanes to the government or something, who owned a house kind of ramshackle probably isn't the right word because that implies that it's sort of falling apart, but it was made already as a series of additions, and this fellow, whose name was John Adams, asked us to do a few more. They were fairly simple and programmatically quite conventional. And most of the stuff you see there, you come in at the top, if that's a 1, and I'm not sure I can read it, but the entrance is there. Most of the stuff that you see on the middle level, which is the entry level, remained as it was. There's a stair in the upper right-hand corner, which you'll encounter again, which had to do with connecting through with a piece that we added on top. And we added some space. Nobody was ever quite sure what the hell it was supposed to do, whether it was a bar or something. But anyway, the views are colossal, so we started, the attempt was to sort of make stuff that exploited the hillside condition of the building. And at the bottom, fireplace and deck and all of that. Nothing in terms of his sort of requests that were particularly prosaic. And then on the top, that piece, which is 10, if I read it right, was the existing bedroom, and the request was to add storage and a variety of sort of bath and toilet facilities, decks of various orientations and meanings, and on the far right, a guest bedroom. So this is straight on of what the building was when we were asked to do the thing. And this is the street side or entry side as we began to modify it. It starts now to kind of use and exploit and exaggerate and exacerbate pieces that were and remain major components of the building, rather than trying to swallow them all whole and kind of spit out something which is totally new and novel. And the pieces, even the essential form of the thing, the roof components and all of that, follow in I don't think anybody quite believes this, but essentially follow along the line of the expansion of the program. In other words, it wasn't a sort of overt imposition of something which was absolutely extraneous to what had been there before. The dot stuff actually was inspired by a Kleenex box, which happened to be sitting on somebody's board at that point. And you'll see that come up again. It was an issue that we sort of worked with and actually may do again. The grid also is something that sort of troubled me for a number of reasons in a number of ways. And I think its lineage, I mentioned Tange initially, who was at one point an instructor of mine. And the business of the grid and the sort of infinite grid as a way of planning or as a way of ordering the frame of a building in turn, the sort of me sense of I start with the grid and all of that, that it has that kind of lineage in my own experience. So the attempt was to kind of incorporate that somehow and then to give back a slightly different reading of it, whatever that means. This is the downslope side of the thing. There were a few bits of fence and so on slipping away. And then the additional sort of stuff. I mean, it's hard to justify it again in programmatic terms. It has to do with essentially sitting and drinking and eating and messing around and looking out at the ocean and the trees and all of that. The bottom piece is now under construction. I mean, at this rate, the Cenozoic age will return again, but it's going, however, tediously. I don't know what the implications of that are in terms of getting to the upper stuff, because by the time the guy wants to build it, I'm sure we won't want to. But at this rate, at least at the moment, that's not particularly a problem. This is another project that came along in about 1980 and is a very different scale and presents somewhat different kinds of problems. It's in an area which none of you have heard of or visited or will, and there probably isn't any particular reason. It's southeast of downtown Los Angeles. It's called Artesia, which is another one of these sort of in a long line of kind of horizontal things that are either part of Los Angeles or attempt to have an identity of their own. We were asked to do this is a developer-sponsored project who I guess had chased a few other architects with not much success. The site is odd in the sense that it's relatively narrow. It fronts on this street that runs vertically here, and deep, so that the kind of conventional requirements for visibility and access related to visibility and all of those things were presented some difficulties. There's also a freeway that slides by to the north and an on-ramp as well. So there are all sorts of odd but interesting pieces that impinged on the thing. In any case, without going through the lineage of the plans, we came up with this sort of curving road. The piece closest to the road at the top on my left, as I point toward it, was a restaurant called Uncle John's. What else? And it was a pancake house, and they had made a particular arrangement with the owner so that they got propriety in terms of location with respect to the streets. So we had to stuff these other three pieces in with that positioning of the restaurant essentially as a given. The other three pieces too are essentially one-story elements, the piece which steps and plan being one and the piece opposite being the other, essentially one-story commercial stuff. And then the other rotated piece on the end is a four-story office building. And essentially what was done was an attempt to build the things in a very straight and simple way, and then to lay over them a different level of kind of language, of meaning, which wouldn't have to keep the rain out or have any of those sort of operational obligations, except to work as part of the process of making an object. The building on the right there, the one-story building, was to be made out of concrete block with this corrugated metal roof and a kind of quasi-arcade. Those two masts are designation points of entry. The thing was to be divided into two units, and then the piece across the way was to be divided, as you see, with this stuff angled in order to make it easier to see. And the plan, I mean, in the real meaning of a plan, there is very little. The space is just kind of shed, warehouse, open space. The perimeter walls of the two little buildings are block with timber roofs, and the office building, a steel frame with a metal stud wall, and then the skin just laid over it. The corner of the office building there was of some consequence. As you can see, it's opposite a kind of major automobile entry point. So the development of that corner, again, had to do with sort of visibility to entrance and to lobby and all of that. This is an early study of the three buildings on the north side. There are a number of these done. This is one study for the office building. There are issues, and again, one sort of wonders whether to justify a lot of these things in terms of issues of function. There is a piece which is the owner had a certain interest in the salvation of the country through saving energy or something. So we did the kind of made the appropriate gesture in that regard. That's not this piece, but on the other side, so that not only the water but the air was supposed to be heated with this solar stuff. There also was an issue of the form and the sign of the building as sign from the freeway, which is the side you're looking at now. And this is the thing, actually, as it finally developed. The corrugated stuff is metal. The rest is it's like a tile. It's actually what they call a face brick, which is put on like a tile. Less expensive. And there was some gesture, as I said, this place is Artesia, and the name of the place was from time to time related with that. So actually part of this cutting of the roof and also some elements of the plaza had to do with literally making an A, so that blue end there lets everybody know, at least you miss it, that this is Artesia. And this is a project also unbuilt, unfortunately, which came through a little exhibition that I did. The owner of the project had about a 30-acre estate in Ventura County, which is north and west of Los Angeles. It's an area where all of the parcels are very large. Horse raising and things like that go on. And the major building on the site was about a 5,000 square foot, I guess one would call it French provincial or San Fernando Valley parochial provincial or something. But it had anyway something to do with the French, at least so he claimed, and that kind of lineage was of some consequence to him. Before we leave this, just in terms of sort of moving through it, one enters the site, the lower right there. The guy was the proud owner of 80 dogs. I'm not making this up again. The dogs were sort of wandering around aimlessly, but they then, when you drive through the gate, they converge on you, but they're all sort of relatively friendly. And the reason I mention that is that that the issue of the French provincial and the issue of the dogs were kind of major experiences in going to see this guy, and they return at one level or another in the design of the building. So appropriately, we visited euphemistically the Loire and resurrected the corner element of Chambord sliced in half. And this was the first kind of rendition of the building. I don't want to get sort of tedious about the program. Basically, what the guy wanted was and he had the means apparently to indulge this level of want. He had two kids, one 14 and one 16. The girl had claims to being an artist, although I guess everybody has those claims, or damn near. The boy was a musician, among other things. And what he wanted to do was to build a kind of pavilion which would accommodate the girl and her interests and the boy and his interests and their friends, and also be able to use the thing on an occasion for himself. So anyway, this was the first study in terms of and again it breaks down, I don't want to say quite functionally, but essentially two components with a point of entry in the middle, and again this sort of language of the circulation and the stair, and the top piece, which is again this sort of slice through, an abstracted slice through the corner of Chambord. In its final kind of evolution, and it was from the beginning understood as a kind of piece of fun. At what level fun is serious and fun is fun, I guess we'll leave to you, only because if left to me, I'm not sure I can answer it. The checkerboard evolved in the process of trying to kind of literally make that point or raise the issue of fun and humor and all of that. The circles, the raised circles, are kings, which are obviously a component of the checkerboard. And it raises another kind of general issue, which has to do with games and manipulation, and architecture and games and manipulation, which may be at least a kind of major aspect of the work that we do. I'm going to say we, I mean we all, to one degree or another. So, however subtly, that also was part of the communication. The entrance point then is there in the center. The building actually sits on the edge, or what became the edge of a hilltop, which was shaved off prior to this intervention. So, I mean, I can't be accused, wasn't built anyway, of defoliating the area. But there were two kind of clear intentions in the making of the form of the thing. One, you came to it from the top right there, at the top on my right, as I face it, which is essentially a flat kind of two-dimensional condition, and then the thing bubbled out as it faced the view and the landscape and all of that. The roof, and I'll come back to this again, you can see the little circles cut there. And the intention was to make those roofs copper, to make the frame of the building poured concrete, and then to add into the bargain some marble. And you see a bit of that in the remaining models. But to come back to the circles are constellations, the dog stars. The big dog on the left and the little dog on the right, that are configured in a sort of abstract way and form skylights into the two main spaces. So it was a way of sort of reintroducing this adventure with all the dogs. Essentially, the top is a kind of service piece, and then the curvilinear stuff is where the major adventure takes place. At one level, the thing was actually understood as a clock, and you can see the time being another one of these sort of recurring problems for everyone. So to kind of literalize that the stuff on the right, in theory, took place in the daylight hours. And this is somewhat abstract and not quite to be literally taken, but that was the artist's stuff. And then the activities on the left, the other half of the clock, taking place in the evening hours. This stuff at the bottom just indicates that if the owner wanted to hold the Last Supper, we could accommodate him. I'm not sure whether everybody should be on one side of the table or not. In any event, he could have his banquet if he chose to do so. Those pieces, I didn't mention, the pieces that poke out of the side there on the little half cylinder hold panels within them that can be kind of moved out and pulled around and shoved and used for hangings and so on. On the second level, toilet facilities as toilet literally configured there on the second floor. And then kind of cargo net. We sort of went through a bunch of discussions, which are actually a lot of fun, having to do with how really to monkey around with this thing. And some of these notions came out of those discussions. The front of that toilet bowl actually forms a kind of proscenium arch for the space down below. You'll see that in a second. And then the top level loft space and access to this kind of circulation promenade around the top edge of the building. Artist space on the right and the more theatrical side on the left. And you can see this kind of toilet profile there and its role as part of the proscenium. I don't think the attempt was to be scatological. I think it was much more in fun. At whatever level fun gets perverse. I mean, that may have been part of it, but maybe I'm protesting too much. This is a study that we did, one of a number, for the artist's space. There's actually raked seating there on the top right, with the risers glazed to let in north light. And a study of the proscenium space with a dog star looking down. And then a collage. We've done a series of these various kinds, which maybe is better left to sort of your own intervention. Essentially, it attempts to raise a number of the issues that occur in the building, but to bury them in one another. It's like a kind of table of contents for the building, but may have to do with your inclination to read the book, which sort of obviously varies and should vary from person to person. This is a little house in Pacific Palisades, which strangely I came to own, and it has a sort of a pedigree of sorts. It was done at the time of what they call the case study houses in Los Angeles, which were funded and supported by the magazine Arts and Architecture, which Barbara now heads. And although this building wasn't, not in its present form obviously, but although this building wasn't literally part of that, it was done at that time, borrowed that language, and could be characterized as kind of clean and straight, and it has that sort of proper pedigree. It was an early user of drywall and so on. And this is what it was. And as it was published in 1948, you read the plan, the access is down that stairway. There's actually a garage up above that, and into a sort of straight, kind of linear organization of rooms. And then it looks out on a patio, which looked out on a canyon, which has been defoliated since then by others. And I'll just go through a couple of diagrams which show the essential pieces. One piece of three proposed has been built. The one we're looking at now has been built. And the parts that were added were the flying wall on the top, essentially the box below it, which is a bedroom and a series of kind of support rooms. This is the second piece to be done, which is a kind of apartment studio. You'll see how this works in this section. Actually, the mechanism is not to tear off the roof, but to build the building over the existing roof, which makes it possible to live in the thing while it's under construction, and also automatically gives you a number of strange conditions which turn out to be assets. And then there's a bunker, which is essentially an underground piece, kind of office piece. The piece there on the bottom left, which sort of slides back in and will be connected off that stairwell in the center. This is a study, one of a series of study models which show those three pieces. The piece that's been built on the right, this kind of long studio apartment business, which looks slightly askance of its neighbor to the right, and then this bunker on the bottom. This investigation of structure and columns. This was one that the first one, which is built, which actually is held up by the wall that it suggests that it's holding up. And then this other one, which is a sort of combination of the columns, I guess, of the Mint in Venice in combination with a clothespin. The pink piece is the bunker. And the blue piece is the piece that's been constructed. There's a kind of suggestion of stair there, although the big steps might be Brobdingnagian and the little ones Lilliputian. It's not a literal step, but it's probably still too close. And just take you around the thing in elevation. And then the plans, plan on the right, which if you enter the building at the main level, in the top there in the center, the existing stuff off to the left, and the plan of the bunker in that right-hand corner, and then essentially this apartment off to the left. In terms of the internal space, and another issue having to do with the making of the building, had really to do with aligning walls above with walls below, which seemed to make the thing a bit easier to pay for, since I was writing the check, which invariably bounced. But that was a sort of essential ingredient. It's not always adhered to, but it made it enforced another level of discipline, just like the one of building over an existing roof. And kind of gave rise to some interesting conditions. You can see here in the section through this apartment the old stuff, and then overcome by the new. That section is taken at the point where one sort of turns and goes up to this bedroom piece, and you can see again the floor built over the old roof, or down to this studio piece. That's again the requisite context shot. And you can see immediately that it makes use of the language of the street. The tile is a designation of that point where the old roof ended and the new floor started. Whether that level of reading is pertinent to the kind of meaning of the building is a question, but at least it was part of the development of the thing as far as I was concerned. Again, the grid and the issues of the growth of the grid and the expansion of the grid, but again in something of a new light. The numbers designate the address of the building. I think absolutely in retrospect, and I'm certain of it now, that one oughtn't to rely on color alone, but that those kinds of issues ought to be dug into or indelibly stamped in the face of the building, so that one can't. It's interesting because I was in the British Museum yesterday and looking at a piece which explains how the architrave of the Parthenon was painted. It's an interesting thing, and it may be well known to you. It certainly wasn't to me. And you can see the residue of the paint. It's quite interesting, but it reads just as dark and light. This is the flying buttress, and that block that sticks out is called the flying horticulture. It holds plants. We've never managed to grow anything up there. I'm not sure why. And then the flying grid, and this, which is the flying door, which holds a sliding door within it with the windows, as you can see, that faces the street, so that in order to sort of increase the artistic literacy of the local gentry, what you do is attach paintings, but nothing too precious, because the sun just destroys it, unfortunately, to the back of a door. It's the pocket of a sliding door, and then you shove the door into the slot, and the paintings show up, to the happiness or chagrin of all, depending who all is. This shows the mechanism of the flying door. These happen to be rubbings that a friend brought me from Bangkok, but it raises sort of interesting issue that we should consider, and it has to do with sort of intervention of things absolutely foreign in terms of the language of the building. You know, I mean, an attempt to cosmopolitanize the building, or to suggest that sort of anything is possible in terms of language. You can see that the flying wall, which is just a balloon-framed wall, turns out to be essentially two-dimensional. That metal piece was just stuck on top of the existing fireplace in order to get the stack above the roof line. This is a gangplank, actually, although it may have other connotations, which folds out from a hinge at the base and lands on these two rubber toilet plungers, which are mounted over a cast rosin. So it finally came back to the surfboard technology. And when the toilet plungers rot, as inevitably they do, although they're supposed to be tough in water, you just pull them off and stick other things on. So it's the old flexibility, changeability, off-the-shelf, prefabricated toilet plunger. And finally built this damn thing, the dots. It's actually two thicknesses of plywood, one obviously painted blue. So one gets, and the plywood is 3/4 of an inch thick, the third dimension of that. And the grid reappears, this time as wallpaper, at a smaller scale, and again wraps itself around the corner. That's the gangplank there in the center. There is a whole kind of alignment of the windows on top and the windows on the bottom and the lights and all of that for those who are interested in that level of order and symmetry and asymmetry and all of that. And I say it not really to belittle it. I think that's part of it, but not the kind of essential meaning of it as I understand it. The view is out there to a field and then to a church. And again, this sort of attempt to collage the thing and to raise You can see there the flying stuff in the form of Pegasus. And another issue had to do with just another house on the street, so that you can see all the other houses on the street. This is sort of a strange one, and I'm not sure what to make of it. You'll have to tell me. This is the same client, different vintage that Frank discussed in a very sort of articulate way last night. Articulate in the sense that a lot of the issues that were issues for him turned out to be issues for me. A very large firm called Victor Gruen Associates built a number of these buildings in the late 60s, one of which happens to be on the best or most perverse or most disgusting, depending on your point of view, a corner in Los Angeles, or certainly in the top 10, the corner of Wilshire and Alvarado. And when we got the job, I was very, very excited about it. It turns out that the presentation of the job as an opportunity and the reality are slightly schizophrenic. At least they were in my case, in the sense that having given you the job and then turn you over to a sort of a manager type whose interests are quite different than the sort of initial optimism had led us to believe. In any event, we were able to do very, very little to the outside of the building, although the first studies, and I didn't bring them along, suggest a whole bunch of stuff on the outside. The building is essentially, it's very near complete. It's essentially a kind of third-rate Berlin museum as an attitude, in the sense that it's a steel frame with double cantilever corners and you know, all of that. Can I go backwards? So that what looks to be dark brown there is just a bad slide. There's a sort of brownish orange tile which kind of designates the pertinent structural element there. And what I ultimately did was essentially to caricature that. I mean, to see it as a sort of cartoon version of Mies, and to make the big column in the wall. In 3 instances, that language is continued inside the building. You can see those legs as they stand there, interrelated with some glass block, and there's a planting area in there which will have actually big cactus in it, which is absolutely appropriate in this context, in this environment. And that's about to go in. But this intervention is essentially a 2-dimensional one. In the sense that the cut into the building is a joint, so it's a cut of about 1 inch in depth into an existing plaster wall, and then those sort of brown-orange notches were just filled up. This is the original interior. I don't have drawings to try to sort of recall as we move to the next what was and what is. This orange piece there is the vault, and there'll be a wall which covers its face and then extends this way and that way parallel to that front face of the wall. And then this kind of luminous ceiling, which we had no problem dismantling and trashing. And then that sort of wood stuff is again the internal designation of the column, the structure of the building. The vault, which is behind that wall, it remains behind that wall, but the door to it was moved. The trouble with these guys is that they had, I'm not sure if it's trouble, the issues that they raise are very pragmatic ones, and they have to do with security and surveillance and sort of teller counters that go on forever. I mean, as we did the job, the counter kept getting longer and longer, and every time we'd come up with a scheme, they'd add a couple of more. And I guess at the sort of operational level, it's legitimate. The bank is a hugely trafficked bank, And that's all probably, from their point of view, legitimate. And in fact, that intention to continue to add finally showed up in a gesture in the building. I'll show you in a second. What happened as an attitude, the thing is a sort of neutral base with three gestures. One, which is this teller counter and teller wall with the guns mounted on the top. Two, this sort of dead whale's carcass hung from the ceiling, which will be wrapped with this wallpaper, which is an amalgamation of lights and heating and all of that. And then a piece on the opposite side, which has to do with a conference room and new accounts and all of that. And you can see there that sort of free piece. The brown is a canopy over the lounge. And then the wallpaper starts now to wrap over this piece, which still has a sort of mechanical look, which starts to disappear as the wallpaper starts to appear. It's a conference room on the end. This piece in the ceiling essentially takes up the axis of the building, which is a kind of, I think at a certain level, predictable gesture, but a legitimate one. That's the way the thing is trafficked, and that's the point around which people congregate and sort of line up, waiting to give or take, whichever they're doing. The slice here through the counter was just, I guess, finally exacerbation at the thing being added to in perpetuity. So we did the counter as a kind of section through the counter so that one could continue to add to it, at least theoretically. This is the man of Wilshire and Alvarado that we did for a small exhibit. In fact, I think at one point we wanted to send it here so that he stands as a kind of symbol of sort of current street corner architecture for world savings. The last thing that I want to talk about is a building that seems to have been under construction in perpetuity, but it's been actually a little over a year, and is called sometimes the Petal House, which has to do with this sort of opening up of the roof. There are a number of kind of readings of that are possible, and the petals of a flower is one. Another one that interested me had to do with something that we start to see always now, whether it's in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Long Island, but this sort of Ticino house roof, which has been lionized and kind of reintegrated into a new sort of language of a new requisite formal architectural language. So that one of the intentions was to explode that intention and to suggest, in fact, that one ought to be particularly careful in using that vocabulary. This is the original house. One-story kind of tract developer stuff with a hip roof, and then the mechanism for adding to it being a hip roof that runs into it at right angles to it. And that particular piece was a kind of prototype for two other pieces that were added off to the right, as you'll see. There are actually a couple of buildings on the site, and this is the back one, which is a garage, or was a garage, and a guest house. The local, requisite local context shot or drawing, you can see the gridded stuff, the profile of adjacent buildings. It's particularly fortunate or fortuitous, depending on your point of view, I guess, but from my point of view, the building had the corner site, which in a sort of Kevin Lynch sense makes certain things justifiable that might not be were it not on the corner. And in addition to that, it has this particular relationship to the Santa Monica Freeway, into which it looks and to which it looks. This is a model which you have here in the gallery. And the pieces you see there on the first floor on the left, the original studio piece, and then a kind of porch come jail cell, really. It's enclosed with reinforcing steel, actually for very pragmatic reasons having to do with protecting a kid from going out and keeping villains from coming in. And there seems to be a good deal of the latter in that area. And then this wall made out of block, which is part of the enclosure for the yard. So in a way, it both uses and abuses the kind of local vocabulary. The piece in the back is built as a guest house built over a garage. And you see there also the swimming pool, which by the time I come back, people should be swimming in, or fish anyway. You can see the access there from the sidewalk. There's a kind of line of circulation which runs to that symmetrical stairway, which is there for, I don't know, the building is there for the stair, or the stair is there for the building. I think probably the latter. The element, again, we built this over the existing roof. The element that was tile on the 708 house is an exposed wood construction, and all that it is, the building for sheer reasons had to be plywooded all the way up. That actually exists on the first level too. The only thing that was done was that the plywood was taken from the outside of the building and put on the inside, or that is taken from the outside of the studs and put on the inside of the studs. These pieces on the wall are read, at least in my mind, as kind of zippers, and as you sort of unzip each one, as you walk along the line, new elements are defined. There's a garage piece in the back. The garage originally was entered perpendicular to that house. It's now entered off the alley in the back. The original house and garage and guest house. None of this is really particularly up to date, and actually the process of building a building has been a special one for me, and has something to do with the guys who are building it, who are extraordinary guys. So that there are a whole series of additions, subtractions, multiplications, and corrections that really don't show up in anybody's drawing, but just sort of show up all over the drywall in the building, which is really, if you can manage to do it, the way to build. And the second level, which is a bedroom and a kind of miniature Champs-Élysées bathroom, the whole sequence of rooms. And then a stair up to the excuse me, stair up to the roof. Then the guest stuff in the back. And then the mechanism for which at a construction level is an interesting one. The mechanism actually for burrowing into and through the original house in order to support this pedal on the top, which had to do with dropping a series of posts, drilling through an original foundation, pouring a new foundation under the old foundation, and tying all of that stuff together. And then a kind of similar but slightly simpler problem for the house in the back. The house in the back is a garage on the first level, and then living quarters up above. And again, what happened in the section, at least in section 1 there, the insertion of the roof over, or the floor over the existing roof. I think there's a few more. The stair, as it takes you up, actually cut through the old ceiling, which was a level of horizontal structure, and then the old roof, which was a level of diagonal structure. So that is kind of literally rendered in that process of going up the stair. And then this inverted skylight is dropped over the entrance. That's that curvilinear piece. And then in this section through the back, you can see that as one comes up that sort of Paris Opera House stair and goes through the entrance, there's a kind of rose window at the end in celebration of the Church of the Holy Mercedes, which is actually the building underneath. There are still a number of things that have to change, this little fence in the front and so on, but it gives you anyway a sense of what the thing is about. Those little pieces that poke out are a couple of thicknesses of PVC pipe. The rails are not rails, but they're nylon ropes, 1.25 inches thick. A lot of that stuff, the black and so on, the vents that stick up off the roof is not complete. Also, you can see the face of the second house in the back, which shows as wood, which will be painted, hasn't been painted yet. And then this kind of porch cage extension enclosed with reinforcing steel. That ladder there, sort of residue of the I Like hardware store look, actually manages to get one from the jacuzzi on the roof to the swimming pool on the first level without traversing the sanctity of the owner's bedroom, if there's any sanctity left in this. Sort of shoelace inspired railing, rope. And you get a little bit the relationship from this shot of you can read the messages. I can't read that one from, maybe you can, but there's a system on the freeway for alerting you to traffic jams when you're already in the midst of it. So if you have nothing else to read, you can come up on the roof and read that, which is actually a luxury because you're usually forced to read it when you can't do anything about the condition in any case. I'm not sure it's clear from the slides, but it actually pulls you up substantially above most of the other buildings in the area, so that there's a level of green. And then beyond that, you see the sort of esoteric contributions of others in the distance. That happens to be a Century City there off to the left. I like this thing. This sort of Prince Valiant-like chimney piece, which also incorporates a heating vent. That happens to be the kitchen there on the left, and we're looking actually down from the roof on the kitchen addition to your left. This is a clear story window in the kitchen. The skylight, and again, the sort of old ceiling structure, the old roof structure, and the new roof structure all show up in that. The skylight in the living room. The skylights are set so that that piece which hangs out is kind of, if you sit in the right position, is sort of looming over you as you look out through the skylight. These are two residues of this sort of structuralist interest. One, if you see through that vent, the mechanism, that white triangular piece, that the mechanism for supporting the building by introducing these 4x4 posts shows up only there through the vent. And then in addition, this column, another one of these sort of odd columns, which actually has, in this context, a kind of legitimate structural function, among other functions that are more pertinent. I don't know if you can see this damn thing, it's not too good a slide, but the wall in the foreground is the wall from which the stair in the back is supported, which is actually covered with a galvanized, flat galvanized metal. And along that walk to the front street is the column, which you have to traverse, but that's certainly doable. The dog, at least, has managed to do it. And the joinery of this thing, it's actually quite a fascinating kind of problem, which had to do with rotating the column, because this piece that was to be supported was propped up when the column was put in. So the column had to be rotated and planned and inclined in section. So we have those joint pieces that occur at the top and the bottom of the column. Little piece out of the Pompidou Center. Then the entry door, which is actually round, as you can see by the shadow, and then the process of... It's interesting, you try to put a lock in a round door. And this is an owner who's absolutely paranoid of the first burglar within 10 miles. And we finally managed to get a lock in the thing. The water comes dribbling off, goes in the gutter, drops down into the next, and falls through into that. Goes on out to the desert, or wherever it goes, the sea. This piece is actually going to be changed somewhat, but it's the lobby or the entry piece, which is the only kind of dead symmetrical element in the building, with this skylight. It's a skylight turned upside down and a fluorescent light placed in it. But it has no access to natural light on the outside, so it made it into a kind of West Los Angeles chandelier. And this is looking from the living room out toward the porch and the street. And then there is this kind of plywood lining which occurs nominally for reasons of structure, but again for reasons which are more important than that, at the point where the building above occurs. It's fastened. There's actually a layer, a structural layer which is nailed to the studs, and then a veneer layer which is screwed to the structural layer. The stair actually is which is obviously not finished, is a carpet, and the configuration on the carpet, if you were on Pluto looking down, is the keyboard of a piano, and that has to do with it's made with dark and light carpet, and has to do with a sort of particular interest of the owners. The two rails are allegedly to accommodate adults and little kids. And this is the detail of the rail at the point where it starts up the stair. This piece isn't finished either, but it's a kind of hyperbolic paraboloid ceiling which sort of jerks you from the living room through the dining room into the kitchen. So again, I mean, it has a sort of structuralist lineage, but I think finally that's not the meaning of the piece. And you can stand in certain areas and you see quite readily the curve made out of straight lines. There actually is a diagonal seam of screws in the plane of the ceiling, which is at this very moment being put in place. And then the back piece, this little stucco white actually is to be painted yellow, and the black shingle there is originally the garage door. There is a kind of discussion amongst the materials having to do with what was there before and what's new and all of that. And then the rose window get to that in a second. The beginnings of the stair. Again, that wood there on that wall will be painted. That is, the redwood will be painted. You can see the beginnings of the pool. There's actually a kind of multicolored tile edge you can see there in the lower right-hand corner that runs around the edge of the pool, and then that wall, which is covered with the first two layers of a stucco coat, will also be tiled. And then there's a shower head that comes out of that wall. You can see the little hole, and you can either take a shower or flip the thing up and use it to fill the pool. Just a couple final comments to try to return to this issue of trying to project how things are or will be or should be, sort of vintage Mies. as he never expected to be shown at the AA or anywhere else. And there's certainly some lessons in that for everyone. And then this, which actually comes out of the Time Bandits, and I put in, I guess, with the last residue of romanticism that I still retain, that sees all of this as a kind of adventure, although where the hell it's going is not particularly clear at any given moment. And then the oar for that ship that made all of this possible. Thank you very much.